Hello, fabulous listeners. Thanks for tuning in to Old Bodies Outside. This is your host, Dr. Brian Peterson. This episode's guest is Dr. Rasul Mowatt. Dr. Mowatt is the department head for Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management of the College of Natural Resources at North Carolina State University. His research interests are the racial geographies of public space, violence and the geographies of threat, social justice, the theory of the leisure class, and the sociology of leisure. During this episode, we'll discuss Dr. Mowatt's book titled The Geographies of Threat and the Production of Violence, the State and the City Between Us. Dr. Mowatt, I'm extremely grateful that you joined us on Old Bodies Outside.
Appreciate it, Brian, and looking forward to the conversation and exchange.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to talk about your book today. So why don't we kind of just jump right into that? And I want to first hear about when was your book published? And so then when were you writing your book?
Yeah. So the book was published, let me remember it correctly, October of 2021 was when it was finally sort of released out into the world, both in sort of physical print and as well as ebook format.
Nice. And so so you got it published in October of 2021. And so when were you doing most of the writing?
Yeah. So here's the timeline. So I did most of the writing in the fall of 2020, actually. So received the contract in October of 2020 from pretty much a cold contact from an editor from Rutledge in July of that same summer. Looking for just pieces that sort of tackled property in a different way. The editor was around the sort of subject matter of property loosely, and most of the authors under her were real estate. And so she was trying to get something else. And of course, we're in the midst of a lot of social particular issues that of course are ongoing, but nonetheless were heightened, at least in terms of how they were represented in the media in that summer of 2020. And so she was looking for things that also tapped into that. And a lot of that, her interest in terms of me came about because there was an article in The Atlantic in which I was in dialogue with one of their journalists around this question of leisure in the midst of a pandemic. And so I raised a lot of issues beyond just simply people trying to occupy their time in quarantine. I raised issues around social strife within public spaces and the issues of potential domestic violence in homes and these types of things that, he didn't really think about. And so she kind of took note of those responses, then reached out to me. And then through negotiation and discussions, we finally had a contract in, I think, the beginning of October. And then from mid-October to the first week in January, I was writing that book that is now out in the world. And I did it within a particular cycle of 1 week of, writing every single particular day. And then I would take a week off with a break of doing nothing, and then take another week in terms of rereading content, going back into old materials and so forth. Just to give people a sense too that while it was 3.5 months of writing, a lot of this material was from previous sort of subject matter and research areas that I had been conducting for a number of years, and they were going to be kind of slated for another particular book. And I saw this particular book being sort of situated within another context of the city. And I'm sure we can sort of get into sort of the reasons why, but that was the sort of timeline. So October 2020 was when I started writing it. And then first week in January 2021 is when I finished and gave it off to the editors in February 2021 for the whole proofing, editing process.
Yeah. So when she emailed you to write the book, you sound primed and ready to go. And it's kind of all serendipitous, and you were just set to get that book out there.
In a way. So it wasn't around this particular topic at all. So, okay. I was on sabbatical during the pandemic. So that spring I was on sabbatical, and my goal during that sabbatical was to finally return back to one of my longer research topic areas, which was lynching, lynching history. And so I was going to draft a proposal around that. And of course, Ahmaud Arbery occurred, and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so forth. These things started to just tack on in at least the media consciousness. And then we saw, the various ranges of riots and protests that began to occur, and then sort of repression of those things. And I started to see something else emerge that needed to be addressed. But also I had this content about cities because I was already looking at violence within cities as it relates to like lynchings and race riots. And so when she contacted me, it was not this book that was at least on my mind and that I had, something ready for. So once she reached out, and I did a panel on something loosely called the Geographies of Threat, because I was talking about how police in particular were responding to protesters. That's when I started thinking that maybe there is something specifically in this realm to talk about. And so then a lot of the content around lynching in cities, like the theories around public space and so on, I just moved over into what now has become this book.
Yeah. Well, what a great time that it got released too.
Yeah.
Very relevant for it to get released at that time. And so, do you have a background? And I know you just mentioned public spaces, but do you have a large background in geography and looking at how space kind of change context with different people's experiences and whatnot?
Yeah, not formally, of course, because similar to you, I'm in a sort of recreation, centered department, have been so in both at North Carolina State as well as at Indiana University, and also coming out of Illinois based program. So not directly in geography, but I moved to a department of geography at Indiana University just before I left there. And that kind of opened the doorway for me to sort of think about the field of geography as a better way to sort of talk about some of the things that I was looking at. Of course, I was familiar with certain concepts and certain sort of scholars in geography, specifically tied to the production of public space. There's one noted person, Henri Lefebvre, that really talks about this notion of public space being produced and produced for specific reasons. And I was always familiar with his work. And so, but I never situated as within the field of geography, but that's what I, came to understand. And so, no, I did not have like formal training or formal background in geography, but that emerged.
Yeah, and that's kind of similar to, in a way, geography's actually emerged in my research myself. I'm almost like a GIS analyst of visitor use management, and start looking at how people's experiences change according to location and time.
Right.
And that the spatiotemporal nuances are very important for understanding people's experiences. And so that's something that has that geography aspect, like you kind of explained, also emerged for me as I got more and more and deeper in my research through grad school.
Right. And, and again, for your listeners, geography is so broad, right? Where you have urban geographers, you have atmospheric geographers, you have critical geographers, you have socialist geographers, feminist geographers. I mean, black geography. I mean, like there is a space for kind of everybody within the field of geography. And of course, with the American Association of Geographers, the actual organization and conference, there's so many specialty groups that, you could get lost, within it because, when we're thinking about the environment, there's the built and the natural, and then there's all these different sort of aspects of it, whether it's cultural and politics and demographics, and they all are situated in sort of different headspaces.
Yeah. So do you regularly attend the American Association of Geographers conference?
No, I do. But yes, so for the past 2.5 years, so the conference in 2020 was canceled, clearly because of the height of the pandemic. But I was able to be involved with 2021 and 2022, and then just this particular year, 2023.
Nice. I've made it to the American Association of Geographers conference once, and that was think April of 2019 in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going to connect that to how you mentioned that geography is really broad. It's got a lot underneath it. And I've never been to a conference that has so many people. I walked in the hotel and it was like a busy
Right.
beehive. I've
Yeah.
never been to a conference like that. And it was really inspiring. And it really showed all those different topics that are within geography. There's a lot.
That's right. That's right. And so it's really a space for everybody. So as opposed to kind of regulating a field or discipline, at least what it seems like, there's enough space for people to grow and constantly expand. I'm sure that there are certain areas that still take primacy over others, but nonetheless, people have been able to and have been supported in sort of creating their own specialty groups that then people can convene in between meetings, have regional meetings, or have topical meetings. They produce their own sort of maybe materials or forums. So it does allow for that range of scholarship and discussion.
Yeah, the range of scholarship it was a really fun conference. I'll have to get back to that conference. But why don't we get back focused
Yeah, yeah.
onto your book?
Sure.
And let's hear about, let's just kind of start with, before we get into the very specifics of your book, let's hear about what was your motivation for your book, as in what societal problems, and I think you've already kind of mentioned a few, but let's just talk about that again. What societal problems drove your motivation for writing this book?
Yeah, I think there's something about city design that works in a particular way to the detriment of people. And I don't necessarily mean just exposure to pollution and transportation access, but where people live and how they're situated, but more importantly, how that can move and change over time. That has always been like in the back of my mind. But what we saw specifically in terms of people's right and ability to dissent and to raise issue, how it was sort of attacked, in many cases, um, and how the design of the space was utilized. For example, when Kyle Rittenhouse unfortunately went upon his sort of shooting spree in Wisconsin, what people don't know, but if you can look in the sort of trial reports, is that people were protesting in a park and they were moved forcibly by police off the park and down a street area that they knew that people like Kyle Rittenhouse was at. So in a sense, they were corralled, directly to be in contact or in conflict with potential vigilantes that were down the street or whatever else. Yeah. And I thought it was, it's fascinating in a horrible way, right? Where here's this space in which public dissent should be okay, which is a public park, right? Place for free expression, where people were at. They had no intent to actually move off of that place. It was supposed to be a rally and a vigil, and that's it, right? And so next thing you know, they're being removed, and pushed off of there for noise violations or something arbitrary, but intentionally down a particular street, because again, they were aware of different people with different, arms down that street. And of course, unfortunately, what ended up happening was exchange of words. And one of the exchange of words was with somebody with, an assault rifle. And then that sort of, progressed from there. And so that's a clear example of what I'm sort of saying that I reacted to. Doesn't mean that's the only one, because I think also Minneapolis, especially after I think the initial indication that they weren't going to take any action, people reacted, and of course, I think set some buildings on fire and so forth. And then there were some similar types of dynamics. But that's what I started to sort of look at, was that not only how cities are designed, in which people are living in public housing or some other structure, and what is their access to a park or a trail system and so forth, but also how we know that there are dead ends and open streets and closed streets, and how we as users aren't designers and so or planners. And in this particular case, the people who were protesting kind of fell victim to, at least in terms of this case, city government that kind of understood the design of the city to dispel or to unfortunately expose protesters to, violence.
So protesters were in this public space that's probably very porous on the edges. You could come and go as you want
Right.
into this narrow space where there probably wasn't easy ways to get out at all, and kind of stuck in this, corralled, almost tight alley space of the street.
Yeah, yeah, and I think people may remember in certain cases too, with some of the protests where they had not turned to any form of, let's say violence in terms of not violence towards another person, but violence in terms of like building structures of glass and so on, like Minneapolis and so forth. There was, people weren't turning to that immediately, but there were, as people moved from a rallying point down the street, what people began to, of course, find out, and there's plenty of like video examples of this, where there were these agitators that appeared that as sort of fellow protesters who initiated the first broken window or the first firebomb or something like that, and then that sort of spiraled into further property damage action that then called for additional sort of police repression. And so that's also another example of that, because once you moved away from the rallying point and now you're walking down the street, now you're exposed to, of course, what's, it's very different to plan in a sort of rallying area, and now planning for an almost endless walk or march, because you don't, that may not have been the plan for the protest. Some cases I heard, marchers that were traveling to like the governor's house, and that was something like 2 miles away, and so you can't really create safety if you just plan for just to meet in a particular space. But then if you have this outside element that all of a sudden is creating increased agitation, what ends up happening is that you can't be responsible for that, and you can't control for that if you were the planner of the protests.
Right. And
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
and you're mentioning these agitators that are appearing as fellow protesters, right?
Right. Yeah. And so again, I mean, some of your listeners may be familiar with this, some may not be, but we have the cases, of course, the social media influencers that, appeared on the scene to like show themselves cleaning up and posting stuff on the wall, and then they would get into their car and they would drive off. But then there were these other people that weren't at the protests. They weren't a part of any particular group. They just appeared. They were dressed in a certain way, and then they would like break a glass. And of course, there would be certain sort of people in the crowd that was already sort of angered, and that would then move people away from the sort of rally turned march and turn it into then this sort of property damage frenzy, if that makes sense. And so there were cases in which some of the protesters busted these people out, like, who are you? Like, stop, or they would like stand by the window, like, you can't break this glass, stop, move away. But the person might have been forceful enough to still do it. And then that sort of spiraled. And so I don't know if these videos are still up on YouTube but yeah, I mean, it's pretty easy to locate and find. And now, not to say that this is the case for every single particular protest that happened throughout the country, but there were plenty of examples of that. These protests escalated due to sort of instigation in this way.
And it's interesting too that the authorities moved the protest from a very democratic space,
Right.
and away from that. Like
Correct.
that is, and going back to geography right there, just localized geography.
Right.
Moving people around. Jeez. Okay, so back to your book here and talking about, we kind of were hearing about what was going on, motivation. You gave a great example of that. what were, as you're lining out the book, you're planning it, you
Hmm.
haven't written a word yet, you're
Hmm.
maybe putting together a rough table of contents, and maybe the first thing that you're going to think about is what objectives am I going to try and address here that I want my readers to really know about. And so what were those objectives?
Oh, Brian, yeah, it's such a great question. Not to say that I don't have an answer, but it's a great question because it's like these are just notes that I have that I knew of the process, and I haven't really been in a situation to sort of like talk about them in any particular way. And so I did. I think I said I did a panel that kind of loosely was titled "Geographies of Threat." So that gave me a title, and that panel I think was in July as well, similar to the Atlantic article. And I just kind of labeled it as that because it appeared like these protesters were being designated as threats, hence the reason why they needed to be suppressed, and in some particular way, because of course there was a range of opinions of what was a protest, what was acceptable protest, what was peaceful or not. But we even saw like the violent vigils, even being responded to violently, right, in some particular way, right? So I had that as a title, and I at least started to do lit review in geography, like who has studied a geography of violence, let's say. And so while the term had existed, no one's so people have talked about geographies of violence and people have talked about geographies of threat, but the literature, at least in geography, wasn't tackling this subject matter with that title. So the geographies of threat that I saw was specifically dealing with United States and Israel as it relates to like policy
Okay.
and dealing with sort of insurgents. Um, that was kind of the literature on that. So it had nothing to do with cities, had nothing to do with anything even within the territory or of these countries. It was more so like border patrol, border protection. And then in terms of geographies of violence, the literature there was, I think, an edited volume that was touching on a range of discussions, some of which dealt with sexual assault in terms of, strangers who may, move from sexual harassment to maybe abducting somebody. And then there were then in that same edited volume touching on maybe gang violence or these types of things. But again, nothing coherently within one particular space. And so not only did I kind of think about what could be a way to talk about this, and I couldn't come up with another particular term. Um, so I still wanted to sort of be in this same space of geographies of violence, geographies of threat. But I knew that it wasn't just about the violence. The violence is the end goal. And so there's something about this threat identification that becomes the more important thing. And so what I wanted to do was not only study, how are threats being sort of determined, but what was the potential history behind it, but then also what would be a theory that could be developed from taking in all this information that resulted from the history of redlining and colonial settlements and Jim Crow era, public housing, policing, bus transportation data. So it was trying to take all of this literature across all these particular fields and try to theorize what's a way in which how does a population get classified in a certain way to then become a threat to then for some form of violence or force to then be enacted upon them.
Wow, wow. So it sounds like you saw, first off, a gap.
Yes, yes,
You
yes.
first off saw a gap, but then
Yeah, yeah.
getting into the history to, almost like the small start of the spawning moment to it becoming violence and going into the history of that, of what's causing, these various classifications in society to be looking at various people in different ways. Is that kind of what you started looking into?
Yeah, correct. And when we say a gap, I mean it's a gap in geography, it's a gap in urban planning, it's a gap in, of course, parks and recreation, it's a gap in city management. I mean, I could not find any particular field or discipline that was touching upon this. There was disparate sort of content that could feed it in a number on all these particular spaces, but nothing that was squarely on this. And so yes, and so I knew that I had to look at, current public records, but more importantly, like I got to go into history, right? And I did not know that I would have to go that far back. When I say that far back, to the 1500s, like I did not know that. But one thing after another kept saying that no, you got to, it's a little bit earlier. It's a little bit earlier. So how does the city get formed, and how does a city get designed when it forms, and had to keep going further back. And some of this is, again, things that I had been exposed to in the National Archives that I did not even realize was going to be connected to this subject, right? So it was like, oh, great. Like I remember when I went to London and I looked in the archives and I got this information, and I could use this, and I can also go back to the archives, right? So huge gap in all of these particular fields and disciplines, because there's all of this rich subject matter that deals with, let's say, the ways in which cities deal with the matter of, let's say, race, specifically, but not only that, but nothing that dealt with it, in a larger expanse. So also globally, but also nothing that went beyond the period of time in which the discussion. So there's a lot of great books on redlining, but a lot of the books make it as if it appears out of nowhere, right? Or it just has a brief history just before it, and it's like, no, there has to be something before that, and what comes before that thing that's before that, and then what comes before that thing before that, and you had, if you're trying to really do a thorough job, you have to keep going back. You have to go off of what the archives tell you to do. You can't just sort of limit it. And unfortunately, I had to keep going back, and what it starts with is then the Spanish Empire and its settlement formation, in the colonies,
Yeah.
and why the Spanish Empire? Because they were the most pronounced. They had the largest expanse of territory all throughout the world. They had the longest run in running their settlements, but also much of what we consider to be basic city design starts with them in terms of the city grid, the reasons for a grid. I mean, they're talking about a grid in like 1520, and for the reasons of air circulation, um, you know, and they were talking about how also you need to have a grid for transport of goods that have been extracted, and transport of equipment in to continue to do extraction. This is what they were, designing and mandating in all of its settlements, again, as early as 1510, 1520. Um,
Wow.
yeah, but that was not like, that's not where I, knew or thought that I was going to go back to. I thought, oh, 1820, 1850, I'm sure there's something like around there. No, no, not at all.
I'm feeling inspired of my own research
Yeah,
because you're so right. And I think this is actually kind of identified a problem with um, investigations in a way.
yeah,
Social science investigations
yeah.
is taking it back, taking it back, taking it back, taking it back. Like I'll do research at a park protected area national park, and I take it back like 10 years. And it doesn't tell the story at all. Like if you want to get into
Hmm.
parks and protected areas, you need to probably go way further back. Like where did this conceptualization even come from
Yeah,
of parks and
exactly.
protected, like,
Yeah.
and get into all that stuff. So that is really inspiring. So as you're going through and you're just going back further and further in time, like, were you kind of getting excited, or you're like, oh my gosh, further back I go? Or was it like, oh man, I'm starting to feel like a kid in a candy shop and just finding out all kinds of new information?
Yeah, no, actually the first. So yeah, no, I was getting inspired because it was you know, not only was it covering a gap, it was covering a chasm. you know, so because it was clear that this was more than just an issue of race, and it was also more than just an issue of discrimination in terms of segregated spaces, right? It really was about as much of an origin of or expansion of capitalism, because the colonies helped to fund and expand capitalism, but it was also fundamentally how all cities. So now all of a sudden there's a linkage between New York and Toronto and Rio and London and Tokyo, because even in the present day, there's a conference of mayors, there's a conference of city planners, they share ideas and they swap ideas and they plagiarize ideas. And so it now no longer mattered, like if there's something that's unique to the United States. Like, yeah, there may be certain histories that are unique, but city design and city function, no. Like, they're all similar. The only sort of present day situation, which is not in the book, because at this time it was still in the early phases of its construction, is the new capital of Egypt. So, outside of Cairo, there will be that new sort of capital that's specifically just for government. That's, I think, 20 miles away from the city. This is the first time a city is being developed in a completely different way. So that's almost what I'm saying, is that from the colonial settlement period up to this particular moment with this new capital in Cairo, all city constructions have been the same, in many different ways. And so not just are the technical aspects of the grid, that's what I started to sort of think about. Not just has the grid existed, or has lasted to the present day, but then how have populations been situated within a city also has been. And so I have to give acknowledgement to Daniel Nemser, whose book Infrastructure is a Race, which is phenomenal, where he talks about how Mexico City becomes the sort of crown jewel of the ideas of the Spanish Empire. And so they really began to mandate its design, expanded it. But then when there was a major riot, almost like 80 years after the city was founded, then they developed barrios, neighborhoods, for the intentional purposes of preventing groups from now rioting jointly again, because there was basically a bread riot, because there was a food shortage. And so everybody, the enslaved population, free populations, conquistadors, immigrants from Eastern Europe or Central Europe who have moved there, they all rioted because of the lack of access to food, jointly. And so intentionally in the governor's report to the Spanish crown, they said that we have to do something about this dangerous mixture of people. We have to prevent them, because at this time there was no regulation about where people could live, even if they were enslaved or not. And so one of the things was they created barrios, separate neighborhood areas for these designated populations. And so we're looking at a segregated neighborhood in 1610, 1620, that then, and some of these neighborhoods, when you even go to Mexico City, they're still low income, like even in the present day, but then just the idea of doing that had to then have become a part of the city planning idea. And all of the map makers and city planners went to the same universities and read the same books, no different than now. There's common textbooks. And so, not only did they adopt the city grid structure, they adopted how to do population control and population management and irrigation control and waste management, and all of these types of things aren't just sort of like possibilities or conspiracy theories or just guesses. Like, no, like they left notes, to all these particular types of discussions. And so then I just had to then follow then the trace upwards. So as the Spanish Empire crumbles, you have France and, Britain, who are the first to kind of feast off of, the shrinking Spanish Empire. But then, of course, once you get into the 1800s, you have the Spanish American War that then all of a sudden the United States becomes owners of all of Spain's final sort of colonies. And so the Philippines and Cuba and Puerto Rico and Guam and all these particular places now are under the United States control. But then also that means, that legacy and, is also part of United States control and the adoption, even more adoption of Spanish structures.
Yeah, it seems like there's just a continuation of a normative adoption
Yeah.
of norms
Right.
that were
Right.
not being challenged. And I think maybe that's another great thing about your book is, looking into this adoption through history of how cities are laid out and be like, hey, like, let's look at how this affects different situations.
Yeah, exactly. And so, like, for example, people make mention of castes, right? And so Spain had a caste system, but that didn't work. No one paid attention to it. No one used it. Um, because, on an everyday basis, if you didn't have a physical sort of layout structure where you divided people or separated people, people interacted people off of their need, right? And so you hired a contractor, regardless of who they were, to fix your roof, right? Or something like that back then, right? And so it wasn't until you created physical neighborhood structures that then all of a sudden, like a concept of race can take form and become a behaved norm, because not only are people restricted in terms of how they're interacting with each other, but now all of a sudden you can create or ascribe narratives onto the neighborhoods. And so then people then are associated with those ascriptions. And so you start seeing press in the 1600s and 1700s about neighborhoods, right? Oh, it's dirty and smelly, in blah, blah, blah town. Um, uh, be careful of walking in the dark, at late at night in this particular area. And this is in reports and press, during this particular time. But that doesn't work unless you have this physical layout that you can sort of control. Because if you don't, then it won't last. Because again, people just, you can't control people's behavior, if you're not controlling the space in which they're operating. People are going to do what they wish to do. And so even if they may think negatively of this person, they're still going to go to their restaurant, and so forth. But if you prevent people from being able to interact spatially, then the ideas of, let's say, race take shape. When we get into matters of gender, it's more so about ownership of property, and that plays a whole unique role in the development of, gender and how it sort of functions. But race and how it functions really comes down to the spatial arrangement.
Yeah, and it seems like with that spatial arrangement affecting race, it's almost like this tribalism starts getting going between these different neighborhoods or barrios.
Completely. Yeah. Yeah. Because otherwise they just wouldn't be there, because again, people are not living over there. People are living next door. And so when people are living next door, well, you're going to interact with that person.
That big of a threat, right? Yeah.
Right. You're going to treat them in a certain way. They're going to treat you in a certain way. You're going to, you're going to lean on them. You're going to eventually ask for support, whatever, because if they live right next to you, they're on the same neighborhood block as you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like even where I live in Kansas, being close to my neighbors around my house, it is important to me and my family. They're a part of our kind of trust network that spreads out from our house, and they help with support systems and whatnot. So, well, let's hear about the different chapters of your book. And so, first off, how many chapters is your book comprised of?
Yeah, so technically 5, even though they're labeled. 2 of them are labeled with the words introduction and conclusion. And that was, I think your previous question was also about outline. That was what the book is in the original outline. So once I kind of developed, is there a thing tied to like population identification? Is there a thing tied to like threat? Is there a thing to, I mean, so I started to see like, oh, there's these three things. Let me see how that works. So at least what the book is attempting to do is you have this introduction that's called The State Between Us. And so it talks about what is the state and also gives people a sort of a framework of what are these three sort of concepts that I'm going to ride on throughout the entire book: the identification of populations, the identification of threats, and identification for violence, right? And so I kind of do all of that in the introduction, and then I get into each one with the next three chapters. So chapter 2 dealing with the identification of populations, and that's where people discover the same thing that I discovered, which is this sort of history, right? So we talk about map making and the purpose of map making, that's not benign, and then the creation of settlements, and then the creation of cities, but the clear colonial history of all of that. And that's why the history of the city is the first, and because it kind of tells us how populations were structured in a city and what was the purpose of their classification and structure. So some cases it was for taxation, so you wanted to have arrange people so to know where you can, especially with the church, you wanted to know where you can get donations from and what amounts, and then how that was then eventually a useful way to, expand the census structure, and then more importantly, how to sort of affirm sort of process of racializing populations. Again, that's ascribing people these particular traits and so on, so that those descriptions could be useful for whatever, right? In terms of being able to move people off land, move people onto land. So history of city, identification of populations. And then chapter 3 is identification of threats, but I tied it in with city design. So the design of the city, is that kind of structure within chapter 3. And this is where I get into the function and purpose of architecture. How does architecture work against people, in what particular way? Zoning. This is where I also get into histories of redlining and also rethinking that history in an alternative way, but specifically how you're not just identifying a population for the sake of identifying a population. You're going to do something with it. What's the point of having an Irish or Italian neighborhood area if you're not sort of fixing them or freezing them in a space to sort of say that that's where crime is, right? And so identification of threats or as threats is the sort of next sort of point in the theory. That's why it's the third chapter. And then the fourth chapter then gets into the identification for violence, which is then linked to, the purpose of society. So there's the development of a city, but then there's a development of society in the city, right? So if the city is just, in my estimation, the city is just for the purpose of extraction of resources, and through that you're dispossessing people constantly, right? Forcing them to work, moving them off of particular spaces and moving them onto particular spaces. How then do people accept it? Well, you have to then create a society, and I use the term fabricated society, to sort of make people accept this, right? So if all we did was just work, that would be intolerable. None of us would, put up with this. But we have a cafe, and we have a movie theater, and we have a mall, and we have a trail, and we have a public park. And so all these amenities make the point of extraction and dispossession tolerable. And so that fades into the background because we're caught up in the fabrication, because of our interests and our desires. I mean, many of us, when we think about where we want to live, where we want to move to. We think about those amenities, right? Schools, and so forth. And so identification for violence, how does that connect to that fabrication of society? Is that we then want to protect those things that we begin to appreciate or value. So I love my trail. I do not want to hear loud music on my trail. And so I want people who play loud music to be removed from my trail. And so am I going to move them? Probably not. I'm going to make a call to move those people. And so violence is then, brought in, and violence doesn't have to just mean a person is dead. It just means force, right? And so um, this is then where, those people who were identified as threats, but who were previously identified in a certain way, um, then are the likely recipients of um, the force, and that could be arbitrary, right? So, again, this is worldwide. And so populations that are deemed for violence in the United States are not necessarily the same in the Czech Republic. Um, and so, but they're still managed in very similar ways.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
And
and,
so
and,
then,
and, and then I get into the conclusion, which then tries to wrap up a lot of those concepts while also talking about ways in which violence, specifically tied to race, kind of moves through a continuum. And I talk about some other particular things that sort of not necessarily sets up another book, because that wasn't my intent when I finished the book. It was more so just ways in which returning back to the city would then what happens with the city as it relates to violence and these other types of concepts.
yeah, and this fabrication is so interesting. I thought that with the way your book kind of started, you kind of talk a little bit about a little bit of your childhood, but then like you got into the Olympics, and the Olympics,
Yeah,
I had never thought about the Olympics like that, and I was, my mind was blown. I was like, oh my gosh, that's been right in front of me my
right.
entire life, and I've not even noticed it.
Yeah. So no, I mean, we'll save, the opportunity for readers to also experience the same sort of abrupt shock. But yes, um, I tried to play off of sort of the idea of relatability. People write now memoirs and so forth, and that's not where I wanted to go. Even though I know people have always asked me, that type of thing, what's your reason for doing this? What's your personal history and this type of thing. And so what I wanted to do was play off of that, but also have this fondness to this photo, that was taken from the Chicago Tribune of my mother and my brother and I at a protest. And so I use both people's need to relate, supposedly, alongside what this photo sort of speaks to. And not just it speaks to a particular moment in Chicago, it speaks to a lot of moments in other particular spaces, and how certain spaces are designated as places for abandonment because they are filled with populations that are deemed disposable, threatening. And so how people rallied in Chicago to try to preserve this building, and that's no differently than other spaces. And one particular, of course, case consistently every 4 years is the Olympics, and how it not only displaces people but demolishes, so many homes, just for the sake of constructing a village and several different types of stadium for these performances. Every single, Olympics. Doesn't say that not to mention, it's not to say that that's not happening with the World Cup or the Super Bowl or other particular types of things. It does, but not to the scale of the Olympics, because the Olympics requires so much more space that any city has to provide, because you have a number of different games, and you're bringing all these thousands of athletes and their trainers and coaches and so forth. So they need so much more space.
Yeah,
And
they
so,
do.
so And regardless of everybody's love of supposedly the Olympics, wealthy neighborhoods are never going to give up their space. And
Right.
so, what space ends up being designated? Because there's no space is empty. So what space is then oftentimes dictated and determined? Spaces in which low income populations are inhabiting, and so either the entire neighborhood is removed so that all the different stadiums can be built, or the stadiums are built right next to it, so that then results in those spaces on the periphery right around the stadium to be removed. But other things are sort of done. Transportation routes are altered because now the city's trying to get tourists to the stadium as well as players, and so everyday people who required the bus to get to
Right.
work no longer have the same routes. Energy, the grid system is altered, the utility structure,
Yeah.
um, but so the Olympics are special just because of how massive it is, but it's not special as it relates to any type of large scale event.
Yeah, it's pretty wild, and let's
Yeah.
put on the Olympics and now declare peace. Pronounce peace for the time being. But wasn't quite like that leading right up to that moment of pronounced peace.
No, absolutely. And so, yeah, so I talk about the 1972 Mexico Olympics, and what happened just before. So while we have, etched in our mind, of course, the Black Power salute from, and so forth from that particular Olympics, um, you know, it's not a unknown history. It's just been forgotten or intentionally forgotten, right? Because it was known in the moment. Howard Cosell mentions it, live on TV during the Olympics. John Carlos and Tommy Smith, both of them mentioned it when they were interviewed right after their salute, at varying moments. But yeah, protesters were killed, who were trying to prevent the displacement of these low income families in these apartment structures by the Mexico government, who wanted the Olympics. And so in a matter of months before, there is this wide scale repression of protests from both college students as well as tenants who were living in these properties, right up to, I think, 2 weeks. I think I mentioned in the book, I think it's something like a week or 2 weeks before the game even opens. They
Wow.
were still sort of displacing people, locking people up in jail, or disappearing people who were, I think Tommy Smith in particular mentioned in an interview saying that bulldozers were running over people, right? This is how quickly that they were. So
Jeez.
they had not even indicated that they were coming to demolish. So they were just starting to knock buildings over during the day, and people were residing in those buildings.
Wow. 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 Well, it sounds like a fantastic book, and I've just loved everything that you've described about it. I think
Yeah.
it's got so much to it. And I did before we got going with this interview. I didn't know like how much depth that you put into this, the historical component going back to
Yeah.
the 1500s, seeing how that leads to the present. Gosh, and I can't believe you did that between October of 2020 to January of 2021.
It was a great coping mechanism. And that's a important sort of aspect to mention, because all of us were dealing with it, and we're still dealing with it. But that particular moment, I think, was intense for all of us, right?
Yeah.
Whether we were living with people or not. In my case, I was living on my own, so just the deeper sense of being alone, being in quarantine, or being very secluded and so forth, for of course for health protection reasons, but also in certain cases, depending upon where you were living at, also by mandate. And so the writing of the book also helped with like my sanity, right? And so that added an extra impetus of how much I end up succeeding every week in sort of writing or meeting my goal, right? So I think the contract was for like 320,000 words. I ended up doing, I think, 340,000 words,
Wow.
but yeah, but each week, the week that I would write, that's what it was useful for that. So it gave me a mission, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
It sounds like it was, as you're kind of talking through, that time of COVID is so isolating for everyone. It's a little bit cathartic to have a mission and to really be putting down a purpose towards, spreading some good knowledge out there that, people are unaware of. I mean, going back to the start of our conversation, you saw a massive gap and I was like, let's address this.
Yeah, and in the spirit of the podcast, I mean, I cannot tell you how much walking and walking outside aided as well, right? So, because I mean, as you say, I mean, the book covers so much, right? So much territory, so much history, so much different, concepts that are trying to be put all into the same space, and so walking, 2 hours, 4 hours every day. And I still walk now, but I started walking to that degree during COVID. And so just walking outside, whether it was early in the morning or late at night or whatever, was just the ways in which I could process stuff. So, things I read, I could now sort of synthesize, and I would, write the notes as I was walking, and come up with the skeleton of the book, right? And so of course there's many things that just couldn't get into the book because, I had to go where the archives told me to go. And so there are things that I guess will have to be saved for something else, because I thought it was going to be, a huge section on, I don't know, redlining and Jim Crow, but that wasn't the case. Thought it was going to be a huge story about political protest suppression, but that ended up not being the case, because it ended up being so much about just city design and the history of it and what does it do as it relates to race, gender, and class. So walking kind of also process a lot of that, yes, the motion of it, but just, as you're walking, you're looking and observing things, and
Right.
it sets your mind in a particular order, because you're now like stepping away. So, some reflecting back on something I've read or some notes that I've already written. And now I'm kind of moving the text around because walking is putting all that in order.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're out there, you are observing the world, you're seeing, kind of thinking about your writing, whatnot, processing. But I've heard that from multiple authors of the act of walking and processing what they've written. There's something that just helps them with further brainstorming, maybe getting an inch further in the depth of their writing,
Yeah.
identifying where they could and whatnot. And it's interesting how the human body can kind of work like that when walking. It's almost like it goes hand in hand with brainstorming sometimes.
Yeah, it was indispensable. I mean, and of course, writing in middle of the night was also, hugely helpful. So I'm not sure how helpful that would be or appreciative of everybody, but no, I mean, it was like the magic hour of 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. Was just, heaven sent, because the night was still, it was quiet because people weren't out,
Yeah.
there weren't, a lot of bars open, those loud, whatever, pedal bars, I lived in the
Oh,
middle of
those
the city.
mobile bars?
Yeah. So I
I've
lived,
seen those. Yeah.
I lived in, on a block that they would travel. But, during this particular time, even the fall of 2020, like the night was silent, even on a weekend. I mean, clubs were dying because they didn't have enough attendees, or there were still restrictions. And so the night was so still. And so whatever I was thinking about in my walk earlier today, in the day, now all of a sudden I had this massive quiet time that I could just go through it. I could just write
Wow.
endlessly, in the night. And, of course I then would crash at, 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, get up 10, or something like that. But that magic hour at the night in the night was then, because it wouldn't be helpful if I just walked and thought and put my thoughts in order. I also needed the similar sort of way to write unencumbered. So walking was unencumbered, right? I was not. I didn't go walk for 15 minutes. I mean, I walked 2+ hours every single day. That was just my commitment that I did for myself, what I set out to do. And of course, there was a range of comfort because I'm walking also sometimes at night. So I was concerned about police and these types of things. So I started to expand like where I was walking, even though the time I was walking was similar, how far I would go, and I would kind of start to explore. So the walking wasn't hindered in any particular way. So I also needed the space of writing that was not hindered. And so that nighttime where it was just quiet and there was no emails coming in, there was no noise outside, and I was right at a desk, right, by a window. It was just a way to I could just go for it. And at least for me, I never cared about the perfection of what was on the text. I just wanted to get stuff onto the screen. I can always fix it later.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you think you'll ever somehow, I don't think you could do it being a department head at NC State, but get into that unencumbered writing mode where you can go from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m.?
Actually, I still do it. Yeah, no,
Wow.
I still do it, but because I try to create a structure of communication, so I don't really, bother my faculty before 7 a.m., 7 p.m. I'm not shooting off emails to them in the weekend. I think they appreciate that. So they have a weekend, and so in many cases they're responding in kind, and so they've given me a weekend, so I really take advantage of the weekend and my breaks, during that time, because I know kind of how much I could write in any particular given moment of time. Similar to like any type of exercise, the more you do it, you kind of have a sense of, oh, if I have a week, what could I do? If I have a month, what could I do? And so I have a good sense of that. And so no, I still do. And so as I outgrow for the book, different people have really been inspired by it, which is kind of weird to think, so there's this one artist on Instagram who is, I think, a painter. And so she's read the book and she's now designing something with maps, an overlay of maps across different histories. And it's a collage, but it's like a 100-day challenge. So she reports every 5 days to some degree, but off of, again, her reading and interpretation of the chapters in the book. And then another particular person who has their own podcast called the Black Myths Podcast, they brought me on and to talk about the book. And the host of that particular podcast really became sort of inspired by the concepts of the book and thought about the ways in which examples like the murals on the streets were ways in which protests were manipulated. The energies of people to create change was sort of not suppressed, but coerced and moved into a different direction intentionally. And so he's actually now going to write a book. We're actually going to write the book together called, it's based upon this notion of laundering rage and protest.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so yeah, it has outgrowth. That was not the intent. That was not my plan for 2023, was to write another book. But that's just, where things have gone, just because similar to working in archives or working in any particular research, you got to go where it takes you. And so if this is what the book has produced in terms of the dialogues, exchanges with people and the communications and ideas that are formed, you got to go with it, Yeah.
Yeah. Well, how great it is to be alive and, you do a project and you see where it takes you next. And gosh, that sounds like a lot of fun. And I'm glad to hear how influential your book is being and other people are catching on to it, especially outside of academia and whatnot, and using it for their projects. That's really cool. So just fantastic stuff, Rasul. Well, I wanted to finish up the episode and just say thank you so much. You gave a lot of depth, a lot of great explanation. Yeah. I learned a lot. And we're broadly in the same research field, but, just like with talking about geography, we're in a big research field. There's a lot of different facets to it. And so it's really wonderful to have you on Old Bodies Outside. You're quite the expert. I was really impressed with everything that you said. So thanks for taking the time out of your day to come on here and, discuss your book. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, truly appreciate it, Brian, and truly appreciate what the podcast is trying to do.
All right. Well, I'm going to throw on that outro music and we'll call it an episode.